Hollywood is a high-pressure, ultra-stressful business at even the best of times, and it's sadly all too common for talented filmmakers to find themselves facing off against a studio machine that doesn't much care for good art. There are countless tales of potentially great movies being put through the studio mangle and turned into cinematic dreck. But every now and then, a canny director will use their cunning to slyly bend a studio to their will. While this manipulation was certainly risky and could have easily had dire consequences, in each case on this list it was ultimately for the best, both for the sake of the movie long term and also for the careers of the directors themselves. After all, sometimes a studio just can't see past the piles of cash they're busy counting and can't just let good artists make good art. Thankfully, these directors had the stones to give the studio the daring runaround. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for Whatculture, here with 10 film directors who totally tricked the studio. Number 10. Ridley Scott and Harrison Ford deliberately ruined the studio-mandated narration, probably Blade Runner. The infamously maligned theatrical cut of Ridley Scott's sci-fi classic Blade Runner was widely criticised for Harrison Ford's hilariously flat voiceover narration, as was only included in the film at the studio's insistence after test audiences found the original cut confusing. Poor Ford was dragged into a recording booth in post-production, and if legend is to be believed, he conspired with Scott to deliberately give an effect-free, hilariously dull performance in the hope that Warner Brothers wouldn't use it. But of course, they initially used it anyway, even despite one of the film's producers calling Ford's voiceover terrible following a test screening. And while their apparent scheme may have backfired at the time of Blade Runner's original release, Scott and Ford managed to have the last laugh a decade later when the 1992 director's cut deleted the voiceover entirely, and the film went on to enjoy a major critical re-evaluation. Number 9. John McTiernan added the deforestation scene because the studio asked for more shootouts. Predator. During production of Predator, director John McTiernan received word from Fox that they wanted the suspense thriller to include more scenes of guns being fired. But McTiernan, having little interest in making a generic shoot-'em-up action flick, decided to comply with Fox's demand in the most hilariously passive-aggressive way possible. To satisfy the studio while not turning his movie into overcooked action schlock, McTiernan came up with the iconic sequence where the soldiers fire blindly into the forest in a vain attempt to kill the predator, but end up hitting nothing. On the film's DVD commentary, the director added, "What I was really doing was to quietly ridicule the desire to see pictures of guns firing. The whole point was the impotence of all the guns, which was the exact opposite of what I believe I was being hired to sell." Even though it was conceived out of malicious compliance on McTiernan's part, the scene is nevertheless one of the most memorable and badass moments in the entire movie. Number 8. David Fincher agreed to change a line of dialogue to a more offensive one. Fight Club. David Fincher has a history of bristling up against the studio, especially earlier in his career, and especially when he's worked with Fox. While shooting Fight Club, Fincher received pushback from the studio for a scene where Marla Singer tells Tyler Durden, post-coitus, "I want to have your abortion." Fox execs were horrified by the one-liner and insisted that Fincher change it to something else. Though Fincher didn't have final cut privilege, he was nevertheless able to wrangle a deal with the executives where he would change the line once, but only once. And so the studio was surely left red-faced when Fincher decided to replace the abortion line with the arguably even more vile quip, "I haven't been f***ed like that since grade school." Quite how Fincher was able to convince Fox executives to agree to his deal is anyone's guess, quite honestly. Number 7. Awon Wells shot the opening scene as a single take to calm the studio down. Touch of Evil. If you somehow needed extra proof of Awon Wells' filmmaking genius, look no further than the production of his 1958 film noir classic Touch of Evil. The film memorably opens with a single-take sequence in which the audience follows a car with a bomb on board as it crosses the Mexican border into the US and subsequently explodes. But Wells didn't conceive this amazing 3-minute one-shot just for the fun of it. Wells had earned an unfortunate rep among studios by the late 50s for being unreliable and exceeding production budgets. And so Universal only bankrolled Touch of Evil after making Wells agree to file a shooting report at the end of each work day. But Wells had a plan. In order to get the studio off his back, he would not only film the bulk of the opening scene in a single take on a single day, but he spread the 5-minute sequence over 10 script pages to give the impression that he'd actually shot more material than he had. And so, once Universal got word that Wells had shot 10 pages, that's roughly 10% of the movie, in just one day, they relaxed and let Wells off the leash. Genius! Number 6. Matt Stone and Trey Parker derailed a PG-13 marketing campaign, South Park, Bigger, Longer and Uncut. Matt Stone and Trey Parker fought extensively with Paramount during production of South Park, Bigger, Longer and Uncut, as the studio initially tried to convince the duo to release the film with a PG-13 rating. Stone and Parker stuck to their R-rated guns, even if Paramount's marketing team continued to create cutesy commercials for the film which blatantly misrepresented its tone as more family-friendly. When the filmmakers received a VHS screener of one of the trailers, they promptly snapped it in half and sent it back to Paramount. But the pair took advantage of a prime opportunity when, sometime later, Paramount commissioned the creation of a promotional South Park music video intended to air on MTV, with all the R-rated material predictably edited out, and the implication once again that the film was rated PG-13. For some reason, Paramount sent the original master VHS of the music video to Stone and Parker for review, and Stone responded by putting the tape in the trunk of his car and driving home. This prompted the studio, who needed the tape back to send it to MTV, to threaten the duo with legal action. Nothing came of it in the end though, and Stone and Parker managed to avoid an apparently revolting, deceptive commercial for their movie making it on the air. Number 5. Stanley Kubrick made the forced narration intentionally misleading, The Killing. Stanley Kubrick's 1956 film noir classic The Killing is a non-linear heist film, and one which United Artists felt was initially too confusing. As such, they insisted that Kubrick include a voiceover narration track, ultimately provided by Art Gilmore, to keep the audience informed on when scenes were taking place in the chronology of the story. But Kubrick, ever the sly dog, decided to have the narrated times be intentionally inconsistent and misleading, therefore only adding yet another layer of dubious reliability and confusion as opposed to actually clarifying the story. There are enough contradictions on the part of the omniscient narrator that he really only makes things more labyrinthine, even if to a studio executive likely not paying much attention to the movie at all, Kubrick lived up to his basic end of the request. Number 4. John Lasseter let a Disney boss embarrass himself in front of Walt Disney's nephew. Toy Story. It truly is nothing short of a major miracle that Toy Story turned out as magnificent as it did, in turn making Pixar an overnight household name and reinventing the animated film as we now know it. During the film's lengthy and painful development, however, Disney Studios boss Jeffrey Katzenberg aggressively insisted to director John Lasseter that the film have a more adult edge, with Woody being more of a conventional villain character. Lasseter had no choice but to relent, leading to one of the darkest yet ultimately most important days in Pixar's history, better known as the infamous Black Friday incident. At Katzenberg's behest, a fully voice-acted animatic was screened in November 1993 for various Disney executives, and also Roy E. Disney, the nephew of Walt Disney and son of Disney co-founder Roy O. Disney. The scene was a far darker and more mean-spirited iteration of the sequence where Woody knocks Buzz out of Andy's window, with Woody bombarding the other toys with insults and basically coming off as an irredeemable tyrant. Roy E. Disney was reportedly infuriated with the scene, to the extent that Peter Schneider, president of Walt Disney Feature Animation at the time, suggested the entire project be scrapped. Though this was hardly a Machiavellian scheme on Lasseter's part to humiliate Katzenberg in front of the Disney brass by having him fail so spectacularly in a room with them, the director was eventually allowed to make the more sweet-natured movie he always wanted to, and his career as a Pixar mainstay for 2 more decades was firmly cemented. Number 3. Mel Brooks pretended to listen to studio notes despite having final cut. Blazing Saddles. Mel Brooks didn't merely trick the studio during production of his legendary 1974 western comedy Blazing Saddles, he straight up trolled them. Brooks was called into a meeting with Warner Brothers executives who suggested a laundry list of changes to the movie. These changes included cutting all uses of the N-word, removing the scenes where a horse and an old lady get punched, and deleting the iconic farting scene. Brooks took extensive notes of the execs' requests, which was especially hilarious given that his contract granted him final cut privilege, and so he didn't have to listen to a single studio note. When the meeting was finished, he took his notes and simply threw them all in the bin. In a recent retrospective interview, Brooks hilariously said, "If I had made their changes, the film would have been just 14 minutes long." Number 2. Christopher Nolan lied to Warner Brothers about Superman in 1978. Batman Begins. Christopher Nolan was certainly a bit of a creative gamble to direct Batman Begins back in 2004, given his lack of experience in the blockbuster realm. But an especially tricky point of contention was Nolan's desire to not have the Dark Knight revealed in his cape and cowl until roughly halfway through the movie, putting his suited-up debut well past the 1-hour mark. Nolan recently confirmed that he managed to quell Warner Brothers' concerns by telling a white lie, by claiming that in Richard Donner's 1978 Superman, Christopher Reeve didn't suit up until 53 minutes into the film. Reeve actually dons his classic superhero duds a short while earlier than that, but by fudging the facts and citing one of Warner Brothers' most beloved and successful movies back at them, he was able to get the bean counters off his case. The rest, of course, is history, and everybody involved must feel pretty damn grand about that deception, all things considered. Number 1. F.W. Murnau added a happy epilogue with an apology to the audience. The last laugh. Legendary Nosferatu director F.W. Murnau seemingly invented the art of flipping the bird at an intrusive and annoying movie studio while working on his 1924 silent film The Last Laugh. The film was originally intended to end with the death of the hotel doorman protagonist, but executives at Studio UFA insisted that Murnau come up with a happier ending ahead of the film's premiere to boost box office business. With the help of screenwriter Carl Mayer, a thoroughly pissed-off Murnau conceived a cynical, parodically happy ending, where the doorman randomly inherits a massive fortune. And in case that wasn't unsubtle enough, Murnau even included a title card before the epilogue which read, "Here our story should really end. For in actual life, the forlorn old man would have little to look forward to but death." The author took pity on him, however, and provided quite an improbable epilogue. The irony of the film's title then speaks for itself, because while The Last Laugh was a massive critical and commercial hit for the studio, Murnau was also able to blatantly register his protest at the tacked-on denouement and near enough acquit himself from criticism in the process.